Hello, dears. Today, as we're coming to the middle of October and we're being flooded with more and more intense imagery and more trivial talk of death, I felt compelled to offer a take I had on a film produced 2 years ago that offers a much more quiet look at the eternal and also at the temporal. This film is called Phantom Thread and is supposedly the last film of Daniel Day-Lewis, the greatest actor of our age, if not of all ages. I really enjoyed this film for its imagery, its ghostliness, its medieval kind of sentiment towards the deceased. And I also really enjoyed it for the strength of the feminine as explored in the film, and at the same time, the compassion it shows towards the masculine. Something that our culture is not so keen to do in most of the things that it produces, and which was frankly misunderstood by many of the reviewers reacting to it. To present my review more clearly, I found that the majority of reviews, positive or negative, described the protagonist, the male protagonist, Woodcock, as this kind of tyrannical Pygmalion trying to mold his young mistress into the type of woman he wants. And her triumph is the triumph, in their opinion, of rebellion, of her strength of will over his. I find this an absolute grotesque interpretation of the story, and I find it even more grotesque that people would see this as a victory. This is supposed to be a love story, and the idea that it is won by violence is absolutely contemptible. It would be contemptible if a man won by violence. Obviously, it would be contemptible as well if a woman won by violence. So, now to break it down. A lot of people complained that Woodcock was a rather toxically masculine figure, as I mentioned before, a tyrannical Pygmalion. That is so unfair, and it really unmasks the fashionable charity that most people possess nowadays. What is fashionable charity? Well, it is the inclination to favor those whom we think are disenfranchised over the strong. And Woodcock, after all, is successful. He's male. What compassion do we owe him? For starters, he's not a toxically masculine person. Even whatever that term really means, it is most ill-defined by the progressive community, if they bother to define it. What's more, he's disabled. He suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is plain to anyone who has experience with the disorder, or like myself, suffers from the neuroses. Case in point, Woodcock's mother. This is actually the first instance in the film where we see that Woodcock is both fragile and under the thumb of the women around him. Hello, you. Now, Woodcock's mother is someone that we never see. I really appreciated her figure. Oh no. Okay, just a moment. All right, where was I? And I should say from here on out, here there be spoilers. So, getting back to the power and influence of the women in this film, both for the good and the bad, I'd like to start with Woodcock's mother. Now, Woodcock's devotion to his mother is one of the really beautiful aspects of the film. That I love his essentially medieval attempts to unite the material with the spiritual in his devotion to her, keeping relics of her about his own person, much in the way people wear religious scapulars under their clothing. He has a picture of her sewn into the lining of his jacket. It's that and his comfort with the idea of her spirit watching over him, this comfort with people who have gone on, like as we're supposed to see them, as we are members of the church militant here on earth, and they are members of either the church suffering in purgatory or the church triumphant in heaven. His dismissal of any modern objections to his devotion, I don't find it spooky at all. It's really lovely to watch. On the other hand, though, and this is something that he is not even aware of, his mother is a great symbol of feminine power in the negative. In some way, she has failed him. She taught him his craft, obviously made him good at it, but looking at her two children, something went awry, and it's hard not to believe she had something to do with it. My main reason for thinking this is that when she chose to marry again, her teenage son made her wedding dress. So far, so good, but I find it hard to believe that the people who made this film, that the costume designer who put so much effort intellectually as well as artistically into what he presented, that they would not know that a grandiose dress, a white dress, a dress with a veil, for a second marriage was unheard of at this time. It was just inappropriate. It just wasn't done. So that her son was going to all these lengths to make this dress for her may very well have been his idea, but it was a great labor, a great undertaking, and it made him physically ill. It exhausted him. It was his sister, Cyril, not his mother, that stepped in to help when the task proved too great for him. It left him, I believe, with the idea that he would always have to be strong, that he would never be allowed to be easy on himself, to relax, because mother would not come to help in the end. So the mother injured him. Cyril, who was also injured by her mother's negligence, at least in this area, I think does a great job of showing the more emotional resilience that women tend to have. Although initially she comes across as Mrs. Danvers, she seems very odd, very controlling, very cold. All of these trappings fall away the moment her brother meets the right person. Initially, for example, we see her talking to her brother about dismissing one of his mistresses. Goodness me, who is she to interfere? That's certainly the initial reaction, but there is always a problem in irregular relationships. Now, our advanced society has taken away many of the natural bad outcomes of living together before marriage, but there are two natural things that cannot be avoided, however much society may choose to wink at it. Men tend to waste their resources and women tend to waste their time because it is irregular and it's not sure what the relationship is or what its goals are, these two things may be irrevocably wasted, but it is easier to recover finances than time. In fact, it's impossible to recover time. So it does tend to be women that suffer the most from an irregular relationship going awry. And Cyril has a sensitive conscience in this respect. She doesn't want these women to waste their time with her brother. So her odd intervention in his personal life actually becomes a kindness by the time we see the movie end. Also, she likes the woman who is right for him. She likes Alma. Gentlemen, if you want to take a practical life lesson from this film, it is invaluable that the woman you love get along well with the female relatives of your family. If they are toxic, it might not be possible, but for the most part, it's very desirable. And before we move on to the most important character, the importance of the female customers, whether it's a customer who bullies him into attending her wedding, or the customers that he likes, such as the Countess Henrietta, Woodcock is very vulnerable when it comes to the clientele. In fact, when the Countess Henrietta, his favorite, decides to stop giving him her custom, it's not just a professional insult. He admits that it actually hurts his feelings. Woodcock is not one for that toxic masculine stoicism. Now, Alma's influence in his life is by far the most primal and the most powerful, and it's time to talk about her. Many reviewing the film had some objections to aspects of their relationship, all of them against Woodcock and in Alma's favor. I think that's most unfair. The first one is the age gap. There is a significant age gap, but so long as both parties are old enough to marry and healthy enough to engage in a mutually satisfying relationship, I don't see why anyone should object. Woodcock is a healthy, active, handsome man of high quality professionalism and monetary success. If one wants to be crass, his SMV is through the roof and he can pick whom he likes. That said, there is another inequality. Alma is poor. She is a foreigner in his country, and while her English is good, there are many parts in the film where it fails her. Some people criticize this as an artistic failing in the script, that they couldn't think of anything clever for the character to say, but I think they were allowing the character to be vulnerable, to not allow her to articulate as well in English as she could perhaps in her own tongue. So that inequality does seem to suggest the tyrannical Pygmalion, the man who wants to form the woman in his image. On the surface, that seems to be true. The first intimate thing that Woodcock does is take Alma's measurements and starts picking her colors. He starts transforming her with his haute couture. But he's so honest about it. It's so clear what's going on. And Alma is not a pushover. She freely says how she feels about it and decides that she likes it. She loves what he becomes. She loves what she becomes in his art. And the beginning of the relationship is quite happy for both of them. Now, it is hard to take Woodcock's coolness when the butterflies rub off. He doesn't want to give Alma a place of authority. He is resistant to any kind of spontaneity she tries to introduce, and he doesn't want her to have a very great impact of any kind on his life. But this is not a deliberate decision. This is his neurosis. He suffers from it as much as she does. And anyone who suffers from OCD can confirm that so many of his snappishness comes from the neurosis. Not liking to be interrupted, sudden sensitivity to sounds, having to have a quiet breakfast, having to regulate any kind of confrontations. These are not deliberate efforts to control. They're part of his illness. And as we find out, Alma is more than equal to the task. What separates her from the other women is that they wanted to be the perpetual brides, the young woman wooed and romanced by this successful man and then live happily ever after. Alma is ready to move on from bride to wife and mother, and she's willing to shoulder the responsibilities that come with that. So when she sees what's wrong with him, his inability to be weak, his fear of being weak, his fear that no one will take care of him, she introduces the very thing he's afraid of. This is the part of the film that presents a great ethical conundrum. Does she have the right to do so? Psychiatrists and psychologists will confirm that exposing an OCD sufferer to what they fear in a controlled environment is a great way to alleviate this fear. Like if someone's desperately afraid of saying inappropriate things, put them in an environment with a few friends and actually allow them to say it, and that fear loses its power. That's just one example. However, since Woodcock fears being weak and sick, it's a much more difficult thing to justify when Alma poisons him with mushrooms. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's the reason that this will be Daniel Day-Lewis's last film. We all know he's a hardcore method actor. I wouldn't be surprised if he gave himself food poisoning to be true to these scenes. So, it works. The first time she does it, he doesn't know about it, but it confirms for him that Alma's the person he wants to marry. But OCD cannot be cured, it can only be handled, and so Alma repeats the experiment again, this time with his knowledge, and again it opens his heart to her, to know that she will be there to take care of him, that she does not simply want what he can provide, but that she actually wants to provide for him as well. She may not be a co-evil in age or success, but she is his equal as a person. So this was a quietly beautiful film that focused on resolving the problems of two well-meaning people in their romance. And I highly recommend it to watch with a cup of tea. May not be the best couples film, but enjoy. It's worth a watch. Good night.